Welcome back to Benny's Custom Works. Today we're back on the KEI Truck and things are going to get low. Plenty of you guys are already familiar with our Mazda Porter KEI Truck. Obviously it's sitting pretty high at the moment. It's the one thing I don't really love about it. So today we're going to address that. Unfortunately there's nothing available off the shelf for this KEI Truck. We can't buy lowered springs, you can't buy reset leaves. There's nothing at all available to do it. I've seen some photos on the internet of them pretty low, so I've had a little bit of a measure and a bit of a play around, and today we're actually going to move the diff from under the spring to on top of the spring, and that'll give us 100 mil lowering in the back straight away. I'm not exactly sure what we're going to do in the front yet. We could potentially reset the springs, but we don't have anything to do that in-house. Another potential thing we could do is actually pocket the control arms and lower the spring through the arm. I'm not a massive fan of doing that because it may actually bind the spring, but we'll tackle the rear end first. So that basically straight up, we're going to jack the car up. Before we do anything, we're actually going to measure the pinion angle because we're going to cut the brackets off the diff and then we're going to relocate those brackets to the underside of the diff. So we've got to actually maintain that same pinion angle when the diff goes back in. But we'll show you guys how to measure that a little bit later once we actually start to pull things apart, and we'll discuss why that's important a bit later as well. This is a digital magnetic protractor, which as I found out this morning is actually designed to set table saw blade angles. I had no idea what it was for. I'd seen them at the hardware shops before. Unfortunately, between me seeing them and needing one, all of the local hardware shops have actually stopped selling them. So awesome Chippy just down the road's actually lent this to us for the day. I've got to take it back this afternoon, but we're going to use this to measure the pinion angle. It's nice and simple, so it's got magnets on the side so we can stick it straight on the side of the diff flange. That'll give us an accurate measurement, so we can replicate that once we move the diff on top of the spring. 6.5. We've just got our angle gauge. We've made sure we've zeroed it before we've used it. It's not probably super critical on this. We've just zeroed it on a bench. Then we've checked it against something that we know is pretty much dead square, the hoist, and it was within 0.3 of a degree off the bat. So we know that for what we're doing with it, that's accurate enough. We've got 6.5 degrees here, which as a rule of thumb between 6 and 7 degrees is a good place to start with a pinion angle. So we're pretty much bang on there for where we want to be. So basically when we move the diff, we're going to unbolt all these U-bolts. We're going to undo the shocks, we're going to undo our hydraulic brake, and we're also going to undo our handbrake cables. And then we're just going to pull the diff all the way out, and we're going to just trim the welds to take these brackets off. The welds are it's actually only tack welded to this diff because it makes like 20 horsepower. So all we're going to do is cut through the tacks and grind them down. Then we're actually going to swap these brackets left to right, because if we use them in the current configuration, the shock mount's going to be too high. So yeah, we're just going to swap them left to right. We do have to also oversize the hole because the pin that goes through this leaf spring is a different diameter between the top and the bottom. So rather than pull the leaf pack apart just to flip that pin, we're just going to oversize that hole. So then that means we can actually go back to this existing setup pretty easily. I've mentioned a few times before, we're not really going to cut this car up much. So I've actually got another diff in Japan ready to go. So we've got a spare if we ever want to revert it back to standard. We've also got another set of front springs in Japan. So whatever we end up doing with this front springs, we know we can also go backwards from that. And I also have a set of front lower control arms. So if we decide to cut those up, we've got a spare set of them as well. So as rare as these trucks are in Japan, there's actually quite a lot of spares on Yahoo auctions for them. So I'd say a lot of people are parting them out because they're rusty or whatever. This one's pretty good, but I have seen some pretty badly rusted ones. So that kind of makes sense why people are parting them out pretty readily. So we're going to jack this up. For those of you wondering why we're not actually using the hoist today, this is quite hard to lift, and the one place you can lift is on the spring saddles. But because we're going to be playing around with suspension front and rear, we don't want to be lifting on here because anything we do to move the spring could potentially drop it off the hoist. So we're going to jack it up and put stands under the chassis rails. To do on the driver's side, we've actually got to take the spare wheel carrier out to do it properly. So we're going to do that, and we'll probably actually just put the spare wheel in the tray, to be honest, because it's kind of a little bit ugly having the spare wheel sitting there. And then in the front, we're just going to jack it up and mount it on the front caster rod brackets. They work pretty well to just put some stands under, so that's nice and simple for the front. But we're going to start on the rear first because whatever the height ends up being in the rear will dictate what we've got to do in the front. So once we do this is exactly where it's going to move. It's not going to change in the back, but the front will be sort of confirmed by where we put the back. So going to pull the diff out, cut the brackets off it, and then we'll dummy it up. After we've cleaned all the paint off, we'll dummy it up in the position. We'll correct the pinion angle, then we'll tack it in the car. Once we've got it all trued up, we've got our offset correct, so the diff's centered in the car. We'll take it out and we'll actually weld them properly out of the car. As I mentioned already, it's only tack welded, so we shouldn't have to do any straightening of the diff, but we will have a quick check to make sure the bearings aren't binding up. We're not going to go to the effort of actually stripping the diff and truing the housing, because for the amount of welding we're going to do, it really shouldn't affect it. Also, because it's not a race car, a couple of mils here and there probably won't affect it. But yeah, worst case we can true it. If we get stuck poorly, it'll help us straighten it up. But I'd say for the amount of welding we're going to do, it shouldn't be an issue. We're not running beads all the way around it, and we're just going to grind the tacks off and clean them up. So we're not going to heat the housing too much. But it is one thing to be mindful of if you are welding housings, especially running brackets all the way around the tubes. It's definitely going to distort the outer. So you need to make sure that you check the straightness and then do correct it before you go assembling it, especially big dollar like 9-inch stuff, because it doesn't take a lot to either damage the wheel bearings or damage the center by having misaligned axles. But that's enough talking. Let's jack it up, rip the diff out and cut the brackets off. We got both of our mounting brackets cut off the diff now. I'm pretty happy with how they've actually come off. We've just cut through the welds. As I mentioned before, they're pretty much tack welds. So we've cut the welds and just tacked them off with a hammer. So we didn't actually cut all the way through. So we tapped them off and it's basically broken what was left of the weld off the diff housing. We're gonna just quickly dress those down and we're gonna grind the paint off from the underside. Then we're gonna sit these on the springs that are obviously still in the car. Then put our diff in, put the U-bolts in, bolt it up, set our pinion angle, and then we're actually gonna tack the mounts to the diff in the car, then pull them out, then weld them a bit more. We're still not going to do full seam welds because these weren't seam welded on in the first place. So we're just going to dress them down, tack them on, and then put it all together and hopefully it'll be sweet. Once we get the height correct in the back, we'll obviously move on to the front and then match it as closely as we can with what we've got here at the shop. Fingers crossed it all works. All the bushes are kind of at their expiry date, if not past it. So we'll do them when we go to fix up some other stuff. We're also actually going to change this to the modified historic scheme pretty soon. We've spoken to the club already and they're pretty much cool to do it once we get it all sorted out. So
As soon as that comes, we'll get off the old purple plates and we'll be onto the blue D plates in no time. We've got our diff position in the correct spot now. We've got it centralized to the leaf springs, and we've also got our pinion angle correct, so we're back at exactly 6.5 degrees. I don't know how that happened, but I'm just going to call it skill. So we're going to quickly tack these brackets to the diff, then we're going to actually take it out and then do the 4 tacks as per Mazda had them originally. Then we're just going to reassemble it, and hopefully it all goes back together the way it came out. No one's ever done this before, so fingers crossed that it actually works. I mean, in theory it should be sweet, but hopefully we haven't just ruined a $200 diff. But I mean, worst case, we could just weld the brackets back on where they were, but there's no fun in that, is there? So we'll tack these in, then we'll pull it out and zip them up and send it on its way with a bit of black paint so it doesn't rust. Got our diff all welded up. We've painted it all as well while we're here, obviously to try and stop anything rusting. Australia's a pretty dry climate anyway, but obviously try and make it at least as neat than before you're in there. So we're ready to chuck it back in the car. We've also got our brake lines back on. These are still a little bit loose just because the block that goes onto this bracket here, we need to move it around a bit to actually get the lines in. So once it's bolted up here, we'll tighten them at each end and then it'll be good to go. Then we've actually got to bleed the brakes once it's in there, but yeah, we'll throw it in and bolt it all up, put the shocks on, put the wheels on. I'm pretty sure we're actually going to have to cut the tub a little bit just to clear the wheels now, but small sacrifices. So we're still not chopping heaps out of the car. That's basically actually going to be the only thing we won't be able to reverse, but when we actually do it, it'll look almost factory. So we'll be able to brush touch that with paint. We won't have to actually paint the side of the truck or anything. So we'll get away with it and it'll hardly even be noticed, I think. So fingers crossed, but should be right. We've got the rear end sorted, so now we've actually put the car on the hoist because we're not touching the rear springs anymore. Obviously we can lift the front without having to muck around with the suspension, so that's pretty cool. I still don't know what we're going to do yet. I'm going to pull the springs out and kind of have a bit of a look at it, and we'll see what happens. I might have some springs out the back we can use, so we'll pull it apart and suss it out, but fingers crossed we can make something happen, because otherwise it's going to drive like that all the time, and that's not ideal, so fingers crossed. When you're pulling the front end apart of any car, it's pretty important to actually look at how it's working and what's under load at what point. So on this particular setup, the lower arm's actually under a lot of tension with the spring acting on the arm. So when you're pulling the lower arm out to get the spring out, you actually have to put some load or some force onto this arm to avoid it basically shooting apart and potentially putting a spring through your body somehow. So we've just used this threaded jacky thing, and then we're just undoing the second bolt on the lower ball joint. So once we've got that out, it takes the tension, so we can use the jack to actually back the tension off that spring gently rather than it flying apart and causing damage to someone. So make sure when you're pulling stuff apart, you actually have a good look at it before you go undoing bolts, because it can be dangerous and even fatal. So it's definitely worth keeping in mind before you just go ripping stuff apart. So you can see how much tension that spring was under. It was effectively bolted on there, and it's now gone to there just with removing the tension on the spring. So it's definitely something to keep in mind. I think I've got a lowered spring out the back. I'm just going to go and check it out. Found one. Close enough. That could have gone bad. That's us done on the KEI truck for today. We've moved the diff on top of the springs, and then we've also played with the front end. Yes, we did cut the front springs, but that is actually an interim. The real reason we've actually been getting this ready is we're actually going to take it to time attack. So anyone that's in Sydney on the 18th or 19th of October 2019, for those of you guys watching it in the future, we're actually going to have this on display. We're also going to be hanging out with the guys at Spares Box. So if you want to come down and have a chat, come and see us on the Spares Box stand. We'll be there about lunchtime each day. So if you're in the area, please come down and check it out. It's going to be a fantastic couple of days. Thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you next time.
Sweet GoPro on a stick, bro.
Thanks. Do I look like I'm getting something?
Yeah.
Cool.